Good morning. I want to welcome all of you to Roy Branson Sabbath School. Our speaker today is Rodney Corker. He's a member of our class, and I must add that he is one of the most active members of our class. And he's going to talk about the roots of morality. He is an educator, researcher, administrator, health administrator. And he made presentations before in our class. And before we start, we invite you to bow your heads with me for a prayer. Holy Father, we are so grateful for all your blessings. We are grateful for the Sabbath day, for the blessings that we have communing with you every Sabbath day. We pray especially for Rodney, for his presentation today. We pray also for Dave Larson, the leader of our class that is in the hospital, that will be with his nurses and with his doctors to take good care of him. We pray for all of us that you will help us to take the right moral decision, that is to follow you and to serve you. In Jesus' precious name we pray, amen.
Amen. This morning I've decided, can you hear me okay? I want to make sure that what happened last week, I believe I was a little on the soft side, just wasn't pinned in the right place, but can you hear me okay? Yeah. All right, good. Well, I borrowed the title of my presentation today from a book. This book I saw in the Wall Street Journal, where there's a short summary on it. It's called The Science and the Good. And the bottom line on it says, the tragic quest for the foundations of morality. And it kind of piqued my attention right away. And so I bought the book and I read the book, and I'm going to use that as a basis for my third session, which is my closing session on looking at neuroanatomy, neurophysiology, neuroplasticity, morality, and theology. And so this will be my closing session on this. This book is very well written. It's scholarly, very well edited. It's quite readable. It's erudite, and it's scientific, but I admire the person who edited this and compiled it together. It's very sequential, kind of got a logical flow to it, and it's very readable, but it gives you an update on the history of morality and where they see morality in its origins has failed. And it's really a progression from skepticism to nihilism. Skepticism because they started out by eliminating God. There is no God. God cannot be subject to science. So we can't deal with that. And as they started to look at morality, they came to the same conclusion. Morality doesn't exist in a measurable form. And most of the attributes that we're expected to display that are seen to be godly, goodness, cannot be subject to any real material reality and be measured. And so as I was reading this, I was sort of getting more and more discouraged. I thought, this is very pessimistic. This is very unproductive. And that's really what the authors wanted us to understand, is how unproductive moral research has really been. There's lots of thoughts, lots of attempts at research, but the research cannot even deal with some of the primary requirements of research, such as definition. If you don't have a definition, a very lucid, clear definition, how do you measure anything? So then you've got demonstration issues. Very little of the research ever got to a demonstration mode. You can measure empirically by observation and experience what is, but getting to what ought to be needs a bridge. And moral science has not come up with a bridge of what ought to be. Now that ties in with what I've been messaging in the last couple of weeks, is that I've talked about neuroarchitecture, pathways, neurons, storage areas. That's all a discussion about capacity. We can measure capacity, we can monitor capacity, but it doesn't tell us a thing about what should be in the storehouse, how we're supposed to live our lives. Morality and theology. And I put some questions out here, and I'm not going to let you this week duck a couple of those, because a couple of those are kind of keen in my mind. So if you don't pick up on them at discussion time, I will feed them back into you. But I do remember an elder of the church when I was relatively young, as a relative of mine, and he told me I have a tendency to merge theology and morality together. They're on independent tracks, and I should not confuse religion with morality. I knew he was wrong intuitively before I was old enough to even be smart enough to tackle him on that. But those thoughts I still find abound, not just abound, but are present in Adventism. And somehow between our theology, we haven't necessarily co-joined or underscored the moral elements of what we do and what we believe in. In fact, these scientists start off right from the very beginning is the failure. Whenever religion is mentioned here, they talk about the failure of the religions to advance morality. So they discount us right out of the gate. There's no recognition even of the Judeo-Christian stream of consciousness and morality, democracy, morality that has powered Western civilization for 2,000 years. They only really mention it in terms of failure. So I got rid of my pessimism as it became clear to me is that when you take God out of morality as a source of morality, and when you deny the reality that there's probably over 2 billion God believers in the world, how about adjusting your assumptions in your research? And say, okay, Christianity, Muslimism, the religions are a reality. God believers are a reality. Why don't you build that into your assumption and see what you can do to help the religions with morality? But I want to point out some of the attacks against traditional moral sources of morality, the institutions that's going on. Today, it's quite apparent today, the attack on venerable institutions, the churches, the Constitution, other cornerstones that define morality, and people want to turn them over and throw them out. That's chaos. But again, it's testimony to the fact that we in the religions haven't done a good job of teaching and pointing out and advancing moral causes. Now, I'm going to pause for a minute and go backwards just a little, because I promised Dave and Peter that I'd introduce myself. I don't really need to be introduced in that I'm here for the third time. I'm a member of a class. People know my background. There are a couple of aspects of my background that I'll share that I haven't said before, and they're not that meaningful, but I feel I will do it anyway. But as an executive for 20 years in Adventist Health Systems West, and I had an office here at Loma for 6 of those years, but I was president for a short period of time and helped set up an organization called Adventist Health Behavioral Care. It wasn't financially sustainable over about 3 years or so, but there was a point here in Southern California that Adventist Health Behavioral Care covered more lives and channeled more lives into Adventist facilities than any other behavioral healthcare system in California. So we had substance. We had around 700,000 lives that were tied into our psychiatrists and our system and the Adventist Health hospitals. But people don't want to pay, the payers don't want to pay for much of behavioral care, as you know. That's a different conversation. We also had a contracting entity that we were able to put contracts in called Pacific Integrated Healthcare, and I was the initial founder and the president of that for some time. I also put in contract networks to bring patients from our hospitals and medical groups in Asia, Guam, Saipan, Hong Kong, and put in that contracted network. And there was a point here that Loma Linda was the largest provider of tertiary and quaternary services to the island of Guam. the unfortunate thing is that the insurance that was sold on Guam had caps on it, to upper limits. And what happens then is that the people that were coming in were very sick. So they'd come in and we would give them a cardiac case rate and other rates for different disorders. But they had all these other things that were going on that they wanted to be done to and needed to be seen to at the same time. And they were blowing through their insurance caps, and I wasn't able to get the insurers to raise those caps or lift those caps. And so that also was eventually had to be terminated because we were being abused by the payers of Guam and Saipan. And so that's a little bit more of my background, but something I was doing that touches this book was my research at UCLA. I did a cost effectiveness study, an economic study on bone marrow transplantation relative to consolidation chemotherapy for adult patients that were in first remission from acute myelogenous leukemia. And in that there, realizing that the economic analysis couldn't just be a cost-benefit analysis, because what is the most cost-benefit way to deal with sick people? Let them die. They don't have hospital bills, they don't go and see doctors. Just let them die. That's how you save money in healthcare. But society doesn't allow us to do that. It says we can't do that. So applying an economic cost-benefit analysis was something that I couldn't do. It wouldn't be morally acceptable. So I did a cost-effectiveness analysis, which looked at the marginal cost of dollars that was spent on these two options, on doing bone marrow transplantation relative to consolidation chemotherapy. But in that model of cost-effectiveness, you have to take into consideration not just the incremental dollar, but the quality aspects, the intangible aspects of the survivors. So in doing tables of the lives that were saved, the number of life years that were saved, some of those studies had been done before for other technologies. But with my professor, my head professor, I was able to do a table of quality adjustments, what we called qualities. And so I identified some markers for quality here, such as the side effects, readmissions, but also activities of daily living. How independent were they? What could they do for themselves? And so I had a number of those, and then because we have a time value for money and we value present dollars relative to dollars further out, I was able to do a time adjustment on the assumption that we people value proximal years more than our latter years. And so I did that matrix trying to get at that aspect of effectiveness. But therein came some morality issues, because what I did then was able to see, how does this society spend its dollars on healthcare? How does it allocate dollars? Is there a rational basis that dollars are budgeted at the society level, as it were, government, to various healthcare challenges? And so I looked at a number of other diseases, disorders, publications, but then I also looked at how society spends money to save a life or a year of life on putting in a railway crossing or a stop sign or some traffic lights, immunizations, prevention, health promotion, illness prevention. I went through all that literature. Now the end shot of that, and this is getting too long, I don't want to distract it in this, but it gets to some of the things I want to talk about, is in the end, society has no rational basis for how it allocates dollars in healthcare. It's simply a matter of the squeaky wheel, charisma. There's no way that someone with an organization that oversees Parkinson's disease, multiple sclerosis, is going to raise the same amount of funds as children with heart disorders. It's just, you can't compete. So, and maybe cardiovascular surgeons have more charisma than neurologists, but it shows in the fundraising. The people weren't interested that much in chronic diseases, but they're very interested in the more sexy, apparent, oh my gosh, this could happen to me or my loved one. And that's how a lot of funding went. But if you look at it from a straight cost-benefit, cost-effectiveness analysis, healthcare was fairly well funded. AIDS was rising at that time, and was getting a lot of money. But on a straight-out basis, stop signs school crossings and changing the camber in roads actually save more lives and more years of lives in some instances. So to me it was a very, very interesting study. I really enjoyed it a lot, but I just want to point out that a lot of the analysis that goes into allocating dollars is really amoral in that it doesn't address any of the intangibles, the quality of people's lives, you know, and how they live, and what kind of side effects they hit with afterwards that are unseen because they come to a big center, tertiary center, and then they go back to their state or their home, you know, and no one sees the side effects. The side effects from bone marrow transplantation, if the matching isn't done right, are horrific. They run up to $3 million worth of bills, you know, and often die very unfortunate, painful deaths, and die invisibly to the center that did the transplantation. And in some cases, you know, patients die too soon because they were not properly informed of what their options were. So I wasn't that popular with a couple of the lead investigators, but anyway, that's my background. But it raised this whole issue of healthcare and morality and how we make decisions. I'm going to move along here. So, as I mentioned, I've talked about the brain's capacity to store information, process information, but nothing about what it should be. The research to date does not, or fails to show us how to live. So science can measure capacity and processes, but not content. Now, I talked about the prefrontal part of the lobe last week, showed you where that was, and introduced the two-track system. That prefrontal lobe area is about a fifth of the brain, so it's quite a large area. But to think about it, just to recap, as a house that has got at least 2 floors, and it affects the way that I think, but it also now affects the way that I pray, because it's like we have different models presented here, and you can choose your model, but choose the way you think and commit to it, and it changes the way that, for example, that I pray, and I'll share that with you in a minute. But the two key areas to remember is the ventral medial part of your brain is more automatic. It's instinctive. It's reflexive. You don't have control over that. It's emotionally laden. So the medial central part of your forebrain is right in here. It takes me into a pray position. So I pray to God, don't let me hang around in the basement too long today. You know, don't let me get caught up in too much emotionalism, road rage, those kind of things. Okay, now the dorsal lateral part of my brain is up here. So I say, come on guys, get busy today. I'm going to spend most of my time with you up here, you people, because this is the rational, logical part of your brain. That dorsal lateral part of your brain is, yes. But however, that calculating part of your brain is also cold. It is emotionless. It is thoughtful. It's effortful, but it's cold. This is where nerds spend too much of their time up here. So the important thing is the interplay between these two parts of the brain. For living and for life and survival, you toggle back and forth between those two every day. Raise the question, as I said last week, what would God hold us accountable for? Does God hold us accountable for what is automatic reflection, important for survival? But the point is, they're intricately interwoven, and you can't isolate them. They are interdependent. So moral thought and character are dual process and independent. And there's a number of researchers and what they call the new moral researchers that are right onto this. So I know that I'm consistent with current moral research. But they can't tell us what is deeply valuable and what is intrinsically valuable. And in fact, they say that morals are not intrinsically valuable. As I said, choose your model and change your prayers. I had visited by a cousin a couple of years ago, and I was commending him for raising his family as Adventist. He was a 4th generation Adventist, good citizen. When I go back home, I ask my non-Adventist friends, how are the Adventists doing in this community? and particularly some family members. I want to know, how do the people outside appreciate them? And they said, this particular family, I like the cut of the man, was the expression he used, a good Australian expression. I like the cut of the man. And I wanted my cousin, who I didn't know very well, I hadn't met as an adult because I travelled away. And I asked him, so I was commenting upon him, and he's an elder of the church. And then there was a pause. We're sitting in front of the fire up in the mountains. And he said, Rod, he says, I have to tell you, I've got some mongrel in me. And I looked at him and I said, welcome to the family. And immediately he started to smile. He looked a little befuddled and bemused, but he felt that he had a friend in the Corker family that was reaching out to him saying, I got some mongrel in me too. And then I said, welcome to the human family. I said, we've all got some mongrel in us. Good and evil runs through the heart of every man. It was hardwired into us at creation. It's part of being an earthling, part of being a human. And he's just smiled and kind of relaxed. Hadn't really thought about that. And then last week I mentioned the notion in our creation, a little lower than the angels, higher than the animals, we're tweeners. But we don't know what went into the petri dish. We don't know how God did what he did. But I'm sure bet he didn't spread any magic dust around when he created humans. He didn't go abracadabra. I think we're manufactured. Certainly the old ancient Semitic languages say we were clearly manufactured. And so when with this relation, I told him how I changed my prayers. And part of my praying now to adapt to this was God, please help me keep my dog, my mongrel, on a short leash today. Don't let that little hominid that wants to run amok today. Let me stay in the top end of my brain. Don't let me fly on autopilot. I'm not good when I'm on autopilot. You'll see the worst of it. And so I'm trying to take that neurobiological model and live it and do something with it. So the Bible has many passages in there, beautifully said last week by somebody, about what we should think, and how we think, so are we. But the fact is, if you don't think it, if you don't act it, if you don't display it, this gets into neuroplasticity. If you don't do those things, if you don't habituate it, thought is not necessary enough, it's not compelling. So you can see what I'm trying to do as I come back and rebuild my theology and think about God is I don't want to say vacuous prayers or traditional prayers. I can't do rote religion. I can't necessarily do prescriptive religion. But I have to own everything I'm going to discover on my second time around. And this is just part of that is I don't have these little idioms, these little characteristics that are reminding where I need to live in my brain. And I've got these automated mongrel hybrid things that are part of my maker. And God knows that they were there in our design and creation. And the thing is, God says, I'm going to come back one day and fix it. I'm going to fix all that. So he knows we've got this automated stuff that causes problems. So Hunter and Nedlewski, moral science, neuroscience has failed to discover the foundations of morality. And the key to this is science has moved from moral skepticism to moral nihilism. General rejection of customary beliefs of morality and religion. Further, no moral belief can be established as effectively true. Or there is no moral truth. Even if moral truth exists, it's not knowable. Wow. How would you like to commit yourself to a science where the end product is nothing? Routinely nothing. I'd like to be involved in a science that does a little more productive than that. And the key thing is this whole concept of what is versus what ought to be. We can all describe what is. Getting to what ought to be, or what any society or subgroup, social group thinks ought to be, or should be, or want to be, is a quantum leap. As I said before, issues of definition, demonstration, repeatability, and specificity all evade neurobiological research on issues of morality. I mentioned those points. One, The authors talk of new moral science, and some of those people are people like Churchland and Harris. And there's some other names that may be familiar to you in this area, that especially the ethicists would read. Hort, Green. But these authors feel they're going to end up in the same place. Their approach is no longer looking for right and wrong. Nobody's looking for that. So when we as Christians sometimes talk about everyone is born with a sense of right and wrong, it can't be found. People talk about we're born with a moral conscience. It can't be found. And personally, I don't believe it's there. This is something that we build. Morality starts in the minds of people. Morality is a product of people, of thinking. God inspired, God instructed. But it's not something that is simply just there. So from the new moral theory point of view is, we're not even going to look for right and wrong anymore. You tell us what's right and wrong. You tell us what you believe. And then we will see if we can help you from there in terms of clarifying your morals and then advancing them forward across other populations. So that's really where moral scientists have migrated to. But basically, moral science is saying that morality is really a social experiment. It's about psychology. It's not about anything that's more measurable, more material, more profound than that. Now, many of these researchers have looked at things that we want them to look at, like human well-being values, order, security, freedom, fairness, health and wholeness, human rights, all thought to have deep social, cross-cultural commonalities. And they say, no, not really. Not really. And particularly at the margin, when you talk across cultures and across populations, there are wide, fierce differences on some of those moral issues. And we have these human rights committees. And they struggle to advance. And they struggle to advance in the face of very strong hostile responses from other civilizations, other communities, other countries, and other religions. So we can't even agree upon what is good and decent, what is happy and just. People have tried to do that. They're really not advancing. So in short, deep flaws and variances exist in what is the good life, and the good society, and the good world, and what is true, and what is good, and what is good. Happiness is not an objective measure. A lot of science and research has gone into happiness. Oh, by the way, and research methodology fails poorly here. Do you know who scores the highest on the happiness scale? Norway is up there.
Denmark.
Pardon?
Denmark.
Finland.
We have no bias in this room, of course.
California.
I think you might be surprised. But clearly the highest on a study of international happiness, North Vietnam. Because you dare not say that you're unhappy.
What about Finland?
Pardon?
What about Finland?
Finland? See, a lot of names can be put up there, but then you have to look at the measures that they used and the stability of it, you know, just for age and sex and all the other kind of stuff that researchers do. But self-reporting can't really be taken out of the context of the civilization of the people and what's going on there. And with this commingling of people and immigration that's going on, it's even getting more and more confusing. So choose your place, and prejudice and bias is allowed. So, because I want you to be happy, Ron. But it doesn't work in a science sense. But the right to pursue happiness is a strong Western value, of course, and we all identify that. So it's not so much happiness, but the right to pursue it individually. And Ron, you've got a right to pursue it individually and describe happiness as you want to do that. But it's just not a matter of science.
But you do find people coming, I don't know if it's still true that this is the place where people, if you go around the world and ask if you could live anywhere, where would you like to live? I don't know where Southern California rates, but I suspect fairly high because at least judged by the influx of people trying to get here from other parts of
Oh, sure.
this country as elsewhere, because the pursuit is, at least in the public imagination, the most unobstructed. You know, come here and your freedom to pursue will be maximized.
And patterns of immigration reveal that, because you don't see how many people are trying to escape and immigrate to Russia or Siberia, you know, or North Korea, the happiest country in the world. I mean, how many people are risking their families and their lives every day to get into those countries? So it's somewhat an anathema, but it really is a social, psychological thing, a perception of where the future is better, rather than a measurable matter of science. So, you know, society is split on values and goals. We can hear it every day on the news. See, what are American values? Both sides of the aisle can talk about what are American values. That's a matter of philosophy, really. You start to talking about strategy and tactics, then you're talking about politics, you see. And then it goes wherever it goes. But in basic matters of justice, fairness, equity, situational ethics is an expression that we hear often. You know who one of the great launchers of situational ethics was, and we use it today? Who?
Fletcher.
Maybe it's not a name that I've heard, so I'm not a scholar on these kind of names, but a name that I want to throw out there was Lenin. Because it's allegedly said that after Lenin had dismantled the churches, destroyed the literature and the institutions, and someone was brave enough to ask Lenin, well, how will you determine what right and wrong is? Now you've eliminated the churches. His answer was, easy. You tell me what the situation is, and I'll tell you what's right and wrong. You see, totalitarianism. But that's still situational ethics. If you talk to, as it is, a policy, even a number of people that are very sensitive on what they call social justice. Some would argue there's no such term. I might lean that way. There's no such thing as social justice. There's only justice. And part of that issue is some of these social issues, until they're written into law and are accountable, measurable, rewarded, and penalized, you don't have justice. Justice is a matter of jurisprudence, you know. And I know the Hebrew think very much that way. But we understand what people say when they use the expression social justice. But as a person who sat in classes for a number of years, social justice can start with any individual and end with an individual without necessary classroom agreement. Two of my professors would fly back in the early 90s to Washington and worked on the Clinton healthcare plan. And there's a number of people in the class felt this is social justice. We're going to get universal health care in this country. They spent a lot of time out of class going back to Washington to work on that. And I asked them when they came back, when it was finished, and I said, well, what is the probability that America's going to get, under Clinton, a national health care system? And they did zero. I said, all that time and all that work, oh, this is a long process, Rodney. This is a long process. We have to get people thinking about it. We have to have some national town hall meetings. We have to inform people, have national discussions. And, okay, I understand that. So what's the time frame on it? Well, probably a decade or more before it comes through, and that ended up to be somewhat true. But I'm a pragmatist. I'm a farm boy. You see, so I'm sitting there listening to this long-term plan, and with zero chance that the Clinton bill would ever get through. And I'm thinking, I'm looking at my tractor, and I could wish it had bigger tires, bigger wheels, more horsepower, had a cab on it, pulled stronger implements, because I've got to get a crop in this year, and I've got to get a harvest, and I've got to get some money, to pay my bills. I can't wait 10 or 15 years. So from a pragmatic point of view, this longer, nefarious kind of planning was not something that kind of sat easily with me. But, researchers also have looked at sympathy, moral intuition, very untrustworthy, even looking at repugnance. There's no universal agreement on what constitutes evil by looking at what is repugnant to us. Goodness is not a natural property. It doesn't exist in any material reality. Altruism, even if altruism could be acknowledged and measured, it doesn't mean to make it say that it's right for everybody. Not everybody wants to be altruistic, even if you look at evolutionary theories, which are going nowhere, by the way, in the moral, since about the 1920s or 30s, in terms of moral theory, is that most natural selection is by nature selfish. Yes, there are insects and organisms, that will self-sacrifice themselves. Even mothers of lions and animals will self-sacrifice. But it's really hard to see how any of that behavior advances evolution. What are the benefits of that? So how do we all live in peace? Some would say we're better off as the Clintons do. We're better off all together. That's the one thing we do know. So you've got this push towards globalization, the great blender, the cultural blender, as it were. And these authors are warning against that, and they say, no, it may work in some ways, but don't overreach and don't over-expect on this push towards the Europeanization of America and globalization, because you cannot force deep values across cultures. There's no evidence. Our research doesn't support that. So it doesn't tell us how to get to where we want. So how do we resolve conflict? We've got demonstration sites. There's democracy. At least democracy embodies the belief that we shouldn't kill each other over differences. Maybe we should start with democracy. We're supposed to talk them through. But the fact is, even that is under pressure these days. You've got the power of groupthink, which has a moral aspect to it. I haven't read the research, but I listened to this research that shows that on either side of the aisle, there is one anchor belief that predicts with 90% accuracy whether the person will accept the entire platform of either the Conservatives or the Democrats. And I'm not sure if I should tell you what those anchor beliefs are, but maybe discussion time, that you might kind of find that interesting. But it brings up the moral issues that people aren't seeing all issues the same. You buy the package, you see, and perhaps in Adventism we've done the same thing. There's 28 beliefs, but if you don't prioritize them, if you don't have anchor beliefs, and I would think that somebody's preaching to somebody, so sit back and say, well, you got me on the first 4 or 5. I think they're the heavyweights. I'll take the value pack. I'll take the 28. I'll take the family lifestyle value pack. I'm not going to fight you on the other stuff or just on the other stuff. See, it's not all equal. And morality may or may not be present in any of that package at all. So the power of groupthink, which is very prevalent today, raises its own moral issues. Finally, towards the end here, I'll finish this in a minute, would be beware of social consensus. People talk today, we need a social consensus on this, or the consensus of the majority is blah blah, but you can't ever find who was in the room when this consensus was established. But they remind us that the Third Reich, apartheid, Jim Crow, the Holocaust, numerous national genocides, honor, killing, foot binding, unconstrained consumerism, genital mutilation, were all embraced by the people. They were all a function of some group of people that developed a consensus, a social consensus on how they should function and behave. So, I thought that was a good warning. But again, there's a sense of hopelessness behind it. So in summary, 400 years, the ideal of understanding moral reality scientifically through observation and demonstration continues to confound us. The capacity is embedded in our neuroarchitecture, as I talked about for a couple of weeks, tells us nothing of content and provides no values. In short, moral science is then a would-be science. It's not a science, it's a would-be science. Yet morality has significant impact on our social discourse. In spite of the lack of scientific productivity here, all researchers talk about what is moral. They use the language. They're prescriptive about what should and shouldn't be. These same people who say we can't prove a thing are still guiding the discourse and the discussion. I'm thinking it's somewhat contradictory, even hypocritical. Maybe you should just be quiet, but the fact is, it's part of our conversation. So, whose domain does morality reside in? Is it politicians? The scientists are saying it's not us. We can't find it. Is it colleges? Or is it the religions who have been deeply discounted or even eliminated because of their massive failures over centuries in this area? So people's hearts and minds today are about as ruthless as they've always been. Moral differences remain extreme, and we have more capacity to throw bodies at each other and kill each other than probably ever before. Starts to get me into thinking more about prophecy. You know, things are going to end badly. That's the prophetic message at the end. And these researchers would say it could end badly because what is created is a void. Nihilism, nothing. There's a void. But voids always beg to be filled. A void just will not stay there. So what comes into that void? And who brings that? Who brings and steps into that void? And that's how totalitarianism eventually gets a foothold. So I agree with those that say that there is no substitute on moral issues for history, literature, poetry, philosophy, travel, broad education, and the contribution of the great religions in terms of understanding morality on its own terms. It's probably one of the best defenses that we've got. And if I was to put a benediction on this, it would be, as I think you might have said last week, you know, when the Bible says what we should think on. And I don't remember that passage, but whenever the Bible says we should dwell on, we should also act. We should act on, not just dwell on. We should act on. We should practice it and demonstrate it repeatedly. That's how neuroplasticity works. That's how we change our brains. So when you hear people talk about America's divided, it has different values, they say, no, we all agree on American values. But on the implementation of them and the strategy that develops after that is, we don't have different minds. We have different brains. We have developed different brains. That in itself is daunting because there's no quick answer or quick solution to that. It's just more of poke your eyes out. Talk around each other, across each other, poke your eyes out. Okay. Thank you.
Time for questions.
Ron, we've missed you.
Was your here and
So they're both La Sierra alumni, so it's okay.
And somebody please address point number 2 for Jack Provonsha, because I know what Jack Provonsha would say on my second question. Okay, Ron.
No, he's going to,
Go ahead.
okay, you know, many years ago, we used to talk about scientific history, and historians thought they could be scientific about history, and over time, they had to abandon that. So, you have shown that the same thing would be true of scientific morality. You know, they're going to have to look to other fields. Science can do many things, and God bless them, although they don't believe they're blessed by God. God bless them for what they do, you know, and wonderful, wonderful things. But when it comes to morality, we are going to have to look to those other fields that you mentioned there at the end. Now, you said, I think you misspoke when you said we should think on whatever the Bible says, because the Bible says some pretty horrible things that I don't want to spend a lot of time thinking about, like happy shall he be who takes your little one, bashes their brains out against the wall, you know. But, you know, I know what you mean.
I kind of co-join godliness with goodness.
Yes.
Broad sense. But you're right.
That sense. So anyway, but I thought it was fascinating, as you were talking, I was trying to think, well, isn't there something that even scientists would agree on, that life is better than death? Well, many people think death is better for them, or for hopeless criminals, or for...
and that percentage is increasing.
Yeah. So anyway, so I have no profound view. I'll turn it over to Richard Rice for the more...
For the profound view.
Thanks.
Thank
Thank you. This has been very interesting and frankly quite disturbing. Okay. The kind of question I would ask, though, is what lies behind the endeavor of people who have come to these conclusions? And it seems to me that there are some fundamental presuppositions that they're living with, but not necessarily acknowledging. And I would want to probe that and ask the question, what provides these scientists with the confidence that their investigation leads to reliable results? I mean, there's a confidence assumed there, I think. Without it, why would they bother? Second, the confidence that their investigation is worth the trouble. Why bother with that sort of enterprise? And then third, what accounts for their obligation to report accurately the results of their investigation? In other words, the whole enterprise of scientific investigation seems to reflect a fundamental confidence in the nature of the enterprise, the reliability of what they're studying, and an obligation to report accurately their findings. So I'm looking at something below or behind the whole operation, and I would be interested in what these people would say about that. It seems to me there's what one of my mentors in graduate school calls an elemental faith in the nature of reality, in the ability of our minds to explore it and come to reliable conclusions. They obviously assume that. Well, then how would they account for that? Or would they say, well, you can be skeptical about the whole enterprise I've been engaged in and about all the conclusions I've come to because I don't have any basis for that.
Yeah. Well, I think the whole book becomes confounding, and they're actually self-disclosed that it is confounding. But right at the very beginning, they talk, it's a journey from skepticism. So the starting point was skepticism. They didn't believe that because they had discounted God, we can't deal with God. It's too squishy. And so when you start with skepticism, you've preloaded your study with bias. How did they offset their skepticism? In that sense, they found what their skeptic minds believed that they would find. There's no moral basis that can be measured scientifically.
I know, but I'm still asking about the basis for that enterprise and the obligation to announce that as their conclusion. There's something going on there, I believe, that's not that different from morality in their own operations.
Go ahead.
I think
Don, you want to go?
you're describing the set that includes all sets except itself, to put it in mathematical terms. That is, there is a skepticism regarding everything else except what I'm doing. And one of the problems with science, perhaps, is that it is unwilling to acknowledge that there are areas of inquiry that are not for which the scientific method simply is not available. There are things that cannot, because it assumes an ability to replicate, an ability to gather data and analyze it in a certain way and make conclusions. But what I wanted to move to, because it's what reminds me on a practical level, and then I'll move to the legal. My favorite quote, or one of my favorite quotes, is from Earl Warren in a case, it was in the 50s, I think it was Trope versus Dulles, but in any case, he used a phrase that I'm sure you've all heard before, talking about evolving standards of decency that mark the progress of a maturing society. And I think that that's partly what is going on here. If you look at society's view in 1865 of the value and of black people, there was a view there that has colored, no pun intended, the rest of the history since then of social relations. But we have evolved, in fact, to a different position, and at least verbally and structurally acknowledge that that was a bad value, a bad moral position to take regarding some members of our human race. And so we are getting better. We are not there. We are certainly not perfect, and there's a lot of racism is an easy area to discuss, but it's better. If I am going to be born black, I'd rather be born black now than in 1860, or 1760. It's just better now.
Donna, in terms of neurobiology or neuroanatomy, can you explain why this evolution or progression or maturation is improving? I mean, what is happening? I'm going to have a shot at that in a minute, but what is happening that is enabling us to be more insightful, more mature? Where is that coming from?
We have a bigger series. Our series. I'm sorry. Not that it's that important that you hear me, but our series is less skewed, and it contains more data than it did at one time. We've got more information.
Thank you. Until recently, men were almost always the participant of subjects of heart-related disease, while women were dying by the thousands, especially for black women. 3 out of 4 black women will either die of heart disease or will deal with the issue. If we're talking about science and morality, until we can respect each other as a continuous breath, and everyone is human and deserves certain inalienable rights, if you will. Until we can do that, inquiry is always going to go to whoever we value the most. And speaking about science and morality, to me, is almost like an oxymoron.
Yes. The authors would agree with you. But what you also addressed was selection bias, which we know as researchers, and you made some good points there. Is that selection bias both in terms of the composition, male, female, black, white, or multi-ethnic, along with what values they bring into that part of people they're going to be studied. And selection bias done properly, should manage that. And as you pointed out, it's failed in the past in many instances. Yes?
I'd like to answer part of Rick's question, not maybe completely, but partially. There is a hierarchy of science in which there are certain fields in which you can actually, through quantitative methods, document reality. These same techniques are assumed by other places, or what I would call soft areas within the hierarchy of education, in which they have attempted to utilize the same techniques that these other areas that can do it, using the same techniques and using whatever else. And I give you a practical example. In the field of psychology, when MR came out with functional imaging, they were able to see how the brain worked to some extent. I say to some extent, because if you look at the data, the samples are very small, and if you've done any functional imaging, you know that the data is very skewed and very scattered, and that very unreproducible, and that the only way they get their data to mean something is to bring together large data sets and then do an average and say this is what's happening. They can't take a specific case. In fact, the disturbing thing when I did this in my early part of functional imaging is you can take the same person, do the same experiment on them 10 minutes apart, and it looks different.
Yeah. It's unstable.
It's, you're correct. And so the variance in, and yet the same psychologists will write articles and present them in the same way that someone, let's say a physicist, who can do the same experiment 1,000 times and come out with almost the same result. That the person in the soft sciences feels that they have to reproduce and talk about it in the same fashion that the other person in a harder science is doing it. Instead of saying that, instead of being a little bit more humble about their data, they act as if the data is the same as, and they're not the same. And so I think that, for example, in medicine, we, versus public health, we deal in very small sample sizes. Our experiments are very flawed, and we do very tricky statistical analysis to come out with some conclusions.
Yeah.
And I think that unless we understand the hierarchy of data and how it's handled, unless you understand this, it doesn't permit you to be skeptical of certain parts of people who are saying that they're scientific. Because science is really along the spectrum. And the people who are the best at it and have the most reproducible results are the ones that do, in my opinion, really reproducible science, while these other people at the far end claim to be doing the same thing as these people. And there's this hierarchy of information, and people, generally speaking, do not have the skills to differentiate A from B.
Yeah, that's a good point, Sir Daniel, and overreach is a key part of what they talk about with some of the science, is that people overreach on it. But from my own, as a science person myself, once it's in the hand of the press, forget about it. Once it's in the hands of, if you're hearing it from science, from politicians, forget about it. I spent 3 years at UCLA going with the professors from the RAND Policy Center, RAND Graduate Institute, going over research and looking at what was really solid, defensible research, and it's probably less than 20% of what's published out there. So you're right. This lady here wanted to have there's somebody else? Oh yeah, but don't forget this dear friend down here, because she's had a hand up.
And that will be the last one.
I'd like to continue to respond to Rick. My career has been with scientists, as a scientist, including a lot of Nobel Prize winners. So I feel I've seen a good cross-section of it. My mentor at Berkeley was member of the National Academy, been nominated for the Nobel Prize, and interested not only in behavioral systems in invertebrates, but also interested in mental health. We had many discussions sitting around discussing science. There was a complete agreement that there were many things outside the realm of science. So everybody agreed in that group that philosophy and religion, really, you couldn't apply the scientific method to. And scientists don't see one scientific method, they see many. But they see a certain way of studying, and they're saying, we apply this and we see if it's helpful, if we can come to knowledge. But there are the evangelists in science, the same as there are evangelists in religion, and they tend to take what's been said and express it with more certainty than the scientists who did the work.
Yeah.
Scientists are over and over again have some hope that their work is correct, but they have some doubts as well.
But the disciples become more zealous.
Yes. Yes.
I wasn't going to forget you. There's got to be a reward for sitting up front.
Well, our time is almost up, but I was hoping you were going to answer some of your own questions here, 4, 5, and 6 specifically.
4, 5, and 6. Oh my gosh. I know our time's pretty much up, isn't it? But I'm prepared to answer any of these questions. And for the second week in a row, we've skipped Jack Provonsha's one here. 4, 5, and 6. Should we end if anyone wants to stay around? Do you want to officially end, have a benediction? If people want to stay and discuss these questions, we want
Well,
to
it's
do it.
exactly 11:30.
What do you...
Well, I think we can 2-3 minutes.
Okay.
I say, let those leave who want to leave, and the rest stay.
Yeah. I'm good with that. I'll make myself available, but I don't want to interfere with anybody's program today.
Then let's have the benediction, and those that wants to remain will remain.
You want to go out into outer darkness? Go ahead.
The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance on you and give you peace. Thank you. Amen.